The chamber was silent, the kind of silence that presses on your chest. Cameras hummed in the background, ready to capture every flicker of expression. At the center sat Judge Allison Jones, her eyes sharp, her gavel gleaming like a warning. Before her stood Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, posture unbroken, hands clasped, the calm in a room thick with tension. No one quite knew how it began. Some said it started with a question, one that was supposed to corner her. Others said it was the tone, the faint condescension in the judge's voice that made the air shift. But what everyone remembered was what came after. Congresswoman Crockett, the judge began, measured but unmistakably firm. This chamber demands order, not emotion. For a heartbeat, time stopped. Jasmine's gaze lifted, steady, unshaken. The camera zoomed in, a nation watching, waiting to see if she'd flinch. But she didn't. Instead, she spoke softly, words carrying the kind of weight that doesn't need volume. "Your Honor," she said, voice clear as glass, "sometimes emotion is what order looks like, when the truth finally finds its place to stand." It wasn't a retort. It was a declaration. The line cut through the air like a bell, resonant, impossible to ignore. You could almost hear the collective inhale of the room. Even Judge Jones, who'd heard every tone of defiance, paused, not out of anger, but reflection. Outside, the clip would replay endlessly within hours. But in that moment, it was raw and real. Two women, power meeting principle. No theatrics, no shouting, just presence. Reporters scribbled, aides whispered, and a few faces shifted in their seats. Because something had changed. You could feel it. The hierarchy had bent, ever so slightly, under the weight of truth spoken with grace. And for Jasmine, it wasn't about winning. It was about being seen. For once, respect didn't come from title or robe. It came from courage. Judge Jones adjusted her glasses, eyes lingering longer than before. She nodded once, almost imperceptibly. The chamber exhaled. But this was only the beginning, because what Jasmine said next didn't just move the judge. It moved a nation, waiting for someone to speak like this again. The marble floors of the chamber reflected the wake of history. Every sound, a footstep, a pen clicking, a whisper, seemed amplified by the enormity of what this room represented: justice, order, hierarchy. And standing there, in that swirl of power and scrutiny, was Jasmine Crockett, a woman who had never forgotten what it felt like to fight for a seat at the table. Judge Allison Jones was no villain, or at least not in the traditional sense. She had built her reputation on discipline, a woman who believed that emotion clouded judgment, that composure equaled credibility. To her, every raised voice was a loss of reason. Every impassioned plea was a distraction from the law. And now she faced a congresswoman who embodied both reason and fire, a combination the system had never learned how to handle. The tension wasn't just personal. It was generational, cultural, structural. Jasmine represented a new kind of leadership, unapologetic, unfiltered, unafraid. To some, she was the future. To others, she was the disruption they feared most. The hearing itself wasn't even about her, not really. It was supposed to be routine, a review of procedural ethics, a question of legislative boundaries. But the energy in the room told a different story. The air buzzed with subtext. People weren't watching for legal nuance. They were watching for a moment, a test. Every camera angle caught the contrast. Judge Jones in her black robe, polished, unmoving, the emblem of institutional order. Jasmine in vivid color, alive, steady, eyes fierce but kind. It was visual poetry, the old guard versus the voice of the people it once overlooked. Behind the glass barrier, journalists leaned forward. One whispered to another, "She's either about to get shut down or make history." The others smirked. "Either way, we're getting the headline." Jasmine knew it too. Every word she chose, Every pause she took wasn't just for that room, it was for the millions outside it. The single mothers watching from their kitchens, the students who'd been told they were too loud, the workers who'd been silenced by someone in a suit. Inside, the tension thickened. Judge Jones cleared her throat. Congresswoman Crockett, I expect brevity. We're here for clarity, not commentary. And there it was, the subtle sting. The reminder that no matter how far you climbed, someone was always ready to measure your worth by their standard of restraint. But Jasmine only smiled, that knowing, patient smile that said she'd heard this tone 1,000 times before and was done shrinking for it. She leaned slightly forward, her voice low, unhurried. With all due respect, Your Honor, clarity is what I came for. A murmur rippled through the seats. The words were simple, but their weight landed. Because clarity to her meant truth, and truth didn't always fit neatly inside the rules of decorum. Judge Jones shifted, her gaze tightening. Something in her expression changed. Curiosity, maybe even anticipation. And in that moment, the dynamic began to shift. This wasn't a courtroom anymore. It was an arena. Two forces of conviction standing on opposite sides of history, testing where authority truly came from. The journalists could sense it, the audience could feel it. This wasn't going to be just another exchange in the endless noise of politics. No, what was about to unfold would leave even the most jaundiced observer wondering whether justice was still something that could surprise them. And what happened next would silence the room entirely. Before the silence, before the spark that turned the hearing into history, there was Judge Allison Jones, a woman forged in the fire of law and the unforgiving weight of expectation. Born in a quiet Midwestern town, she was the daughter of a factory worker and a school teacher, raised on the belief that rules were the only thing keeping chaos from consuming the world. She climbed every rung of the ladder the hard way. No shortcuts, no favors. Every gavel she struck carried the echo of those long nights in law school libraries, her fingers tracing case law until dawn. Her reputation was built on precision, no theatrics, no tolerance for spectacle. In her court, emotion was the enemy of reason, and reason was sacred. She was respected, yes, even feared, but also isolated. Few saw the woman behind the robe, the one who still believed that fairness could be measured in logic. To her, order wasn't just a practice, it was faith. And yet, in recent years, cracks had begun to form in that faith. She'd watched the world grow louder, angrier, more chaotic. Passion had replaced persuasion. Hashtags had replaced discourse. The decorum she once cherished now seemed almost archaic. She told herself she was unmoved by it, but she felt something deeper, the quiet ache of irrelevance. So when Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett walked into her chamber, radiant, unapologetic, defiance without hostility, Judge Jones recognized something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't defiance for the sake of spectacle. It was truth dressed in courage. It was what she used to believe the law could do before it became a cage of its own making. Still, instinct won over curiosity. The moment Jasmine's name hit the docket, the judge's jaw set. She expected another performance, another politician spinning the courtroom into a stage. Her opening remark, clipped and cold, was her defense mechanism. Keep control, maintain the balance, never let emotion in. But Jasmine didn't play by those old rules. She answered with grace, not aggression, and that confused the judge more than it should have. The woman before her wasn't trying to win points. She was trying to speak truth into a space that had long silenced voices like hers. The judge's mind drifted, briefly, to a memory. Years ago, a young woman had once stood before her, trembling, trying to explain why she spoke out against an injustice that cost her job. Allison had silenced her then, insisting on relevance. The woman had walked away in tears, her story untold. For the first time, the judge wondered what would have happened if she had listened instead. Now, looking at Jasmine, she felt that same defiant energy. But this time, it wasn't trembling. It was centered. It was powerful. And somewhere deep down, Judge Jones knew she was standing in front of the kind of conviction the system itself had forgotten how to honor. Still, her pride whispered louder than her conscience. Don't lose control. You are the authority here. So she pressed harder. Questions sharpened, tone cooled. The camera caught none of the micro movements, the twitch of her fingers, the fleeting flash of intrigue in her eyes. But inside, a quiet war was unfolding, her lifelong devotion to order against the creeping realization that order, without empathy, was just control. For the first time in years, she felt something she hadn't felt behind that bench. Doubt, not in herself, but in the very idea that silence equaled respect. When Jasmine spoke, calm and articulate, the judge found herself listening, truly listening, against her own will. The Congresswoman wasn't dismantling the court. She was honoring it by demanding truth within it. And that's what rattled her most. It wasn't rebellion. It was integrity. And integrity, spoken without fear, has a sound that authority can't ignore. The judge's voice faltered once, a slight pause that didn't go unnoticed. The room felt it. The cameras felt it. Jasmine felt it. That was the moment everything shifted. The system had met its reflection, not its enemy, but its mirror. And in that reflection, Judge Allison Jones saw the truth she'd spent her entire career avoiding. Power means nothing if it cannot respect courage. The gavel rested still on the bench. The silence in the room thickened again. But now, the question wasn't whether Jasmine Crockett could handle the pressure. The question was whether the system and the woman who upheld it could handle her. And as that realization flickered behind the judge's eyes, the air in the chamber seemed to hum with anticipation. Because what was about to happen next would challenge everything she believed about power, respect, and who truly commands the room. Long before Jasmine Crockett stood before the bench of Judge Allison Jones, she stood in the small, dimly lit living room of her childhood home, watching her mother iron uniforms late into the night. The rhythm of that iron, the hiss, the press, the steam, became the soundtrack of determination. Her mother never said much, but her silence spoke volumes. You will have to fight twice as hard to be heard once. Jasmine learned early that dignity isn't something you're given, it's something you hold on to, even when the world tries to take it. In classrooms where her hand was ignored, in meetings where her ideas were borrowed, she didn't grow bitter, she grew sharper. By the time she reached law school, she'd mastered the art of being underestimated. She sat in lecture halls filled with people who thought her Southern accent and unfiltered honesty were weaknesses. They didn't see the quiet steel behind her smile. When professors questioned her methods, she smiled again, then outperformed them all. Her first years as a public defender were the forge. She saw mothers in tears, sons in shackles, fathers broken by a system that promised fairness but delivered statistics. She realized then that justice was not blind, it just refused to look certain people in the eye. And every time she stood in that courtroom, she vowed to force its gaze. There were days the weight almost crushed her. Late nights when files towered around her like walls, and she wondered if the system could ever truly change. But then she'd remember her mother's voice barely above a whisper. You don't stop because they expect you to. That voice carried her through every barrier, through the cynicism, the microaggressions, the whispered too ambitious labels. And when she ran for Congress, she ran not for fame, but for the people who had been told that fairness wasn't built for them. Her campaign was grassroots, fueled by volunteers who believed in something bigger than politics. They believed in her. The headlines that followed painted her as bold, sometimes fiery, always controversial. But those who knew her best understood something different. Jasmine's fire was never about ego. It was about protection, for truth, for her community, for those who couldn't afford to be quiet. And yet, even with every success, she faced the same coded pushback, the tone policing, the veiled reminders to stay respectful. It didn't matter that she had the facts, the degrees, or the votes. Some people just couldn't stomach a woman, a Black woman, who spoke power with grace instead of apology. So, when she stepped into Judge Jones's chamber that morning, she carried not just her own story, but the weight of everyone who'd ever been silenced by decorum. Every woman told she was too emotional. Every immigrant told they didn't belong. Every voice dismissed as disruptive for daring to speak truth. But Jasmine didn't see herself as a symbol. She saw herself as a servant, a protector of the principle that truth doesn't need permission to exist. That morning, as she adjusted the lapel of her blazer, she caught her reflection in a nearby window. For a moment, she saw not the congresswoman or the lawyer, but the little girl watching her mother iron in silence, the child who learned that grace could coexist with grit. She smiled, because that little girl had made it here, not by changing who she was, but by refusing to let anyone else define her. When she entered the chamber, her steps echoed, soft but steady. The reporters saw confidence. What they didn't see was the years of exhaustion behind it, the countless moments of restraint, the practiced control of someone who had learned to make silence her sharpest weapon. Judge Jones glanced up, expression unreadable. The unspoken challenge hung in the air. Jasmine nodded respectfully, taking her seat. Her composure wasn't submission, it was strategy. She knew how rooms like this worked. Respect was currency, but so was clarity, and she intended to spend both wisely. She reviewed her notes once, then placed them aside. She didn't need them. Her argument wasn't written on paper. It was written in her experience, her endurance, her truth. And when the questioning began, sharp, precise, skeptical, she was ready. She had weathered harsher interrogations, faced colder rooms. Still, she could sense something different in this one. Beneath the judge's cool tone, there was curiosity and perhaps a flicker of challenge. But Jasmine wasn't intimidated. She leaned forward slightly, calm and deliberate, her voice carrying the same steady rhythm she'd learned from her mother's iron all those years ago. Each word deliberate, each truth undeniable. Because Jasmine Crockett didn't come to the chamber to prove herself. She came to remind the room, and maybe even the judge, that respect and rebellion aren't opposites. They're often the same thing, spoken in different tones. And in that instant, as she met the judge's gaze, something unspoken passed between them. Not rivalry, but recognition. Still, the air was charged. The questions would get harder, the tone sharper, the test more personal. Because when grace confronts power, power rarely yields easily. And the next few moments would prove just how much truth the system could bear before it tried to silence it again. The room was a storm pretending to be still. Cameras flickered like lightning in the distance, catching every shift of expression, every tightening jaw. Judge Allison Jones leaned slightly forward, her voice slicing through the silence. "Congresswoman Crockett," she said, each syllable crisp, deliberate. "Your testimony is appreciated, but let's remember the boundaries of this hearing. Stick to the question asked." It wasn't a rebuke, not entirely, more a warning dressed in civility, the kind of tone Jasmine had heard her entire career. She recognized it instantly, the polite voice of control, the reminder of where power was expected to sit. But Jasmine didn't blink. Her gaze was steady, her tone unshaken. "With respect, Your Honor, sometimes the truth doesn't fit neatly inside the boundaries." The line rippled through the chamber like a quiet tremor. A few heads lifted, aides exchanged glances. Even the stenographer hesitated, unsure if she'd heard correctly. Judge Jones's eyes narrowed, but it wasn't anger. It was calculation. She'd faced senators, governors, billionaires, all of them confident, all of them certain they could charm or challenge her authority. But this was different. Jasmine wasn't performing. She was present. Every word came from lived conviction, not political instinct. Boundaries have their place, but when they start to silence truth, they stop protecting justice and start protecting comfort. The judge's gavel hovered. For a second, it seemed she might strike it down, but she didn't. Instead, she let the words hang there, like smoke that refused to clear. Behind her, a young clerk shifted nervously. On the front row, a journalist mouthed, "Wow." Jasmine leaned back, exhaling slowly. She hadn't raised her voice, she hadn't broken decorum. Yet the temperature in the room had changed. Judge Jones cleared her throat. "You believe this proceeding is silencing truth?" Jasmine met her gaze. "I believe truth is often inconvenient, and I've learned that when it starts to make people uncomfortable, that's when it's finally doing its job." For the first time, a faint smile flickered at the corner of the judge's mouth. Not amusement, but recognition. She'd once believed that herself, years ago, before experience hardened her into formality. The back and forth continued, each exchange more charged than the last. The judge pressing with logic, Jasmine answering with lived truth. A contest between protocol and principle. And then a moment. Judge Jones raised an eyebrow. "So you're saying, Congresswoman, that your conviction gives you license to ignore process?" Jasmine didn't hesitate. "No, Your Honor, I'm saying process without purpose is just theater." Gasps, audible, unfiltered. The chamber crackled with disbelief. Jones leaned back slightly, her eyes fixed on Jasmine, no longer adversarial, but searching. Somewhere deep behind her practiced restraint, something shifted. Outside the chamber, the reporters were already drafting headlines. Inside, the tension reached its breaking point. But Jasmine didn't gloat, she didn't push. She let the silence speak for her. Because she knew that in moments like these, silence was more powerful than shouting. It forced everyone to sit with what had just been said. Judge Jones glanced at her notes, then back at Jasmine. "You have a way with words, Congresswoman," she said evenly. "Let's see if they hold under scrutiny." Jasmine nodded once. They always do, when they're the truth. The judge's pen froze mid-note. A flicker of something unreadable passed across her face, part irritation, part respect. The chamber breathed, uneasy but captivated. No one spoke for several seconds. Even the sound of the cameras seemed to fade into the background. And then, in that fragile, electric stillness, Jasmine leaned forward just enough for the microphone to catch her next line, one that would ignite every newsfeed in the country by sundown. Because what came next wasn't just a defense, it was the moment Jasmine Crockett's voice turned from argument into history. The chamber was so still it almost hummed. You could feel the anticipation in the air, that invisible tightening before something irreversible. Judge Allison Jones leaned back, poised, her expression unreadable, a fortress behind her eyes. "Congresswoman," she said, firm but faintly strained, "this committee is not here to indulge in emotional displays. We are here for facts." Jasmine exhaled slowly. The words were familiar, a melody she'd heard all her life. Too loud, too emotional, too much. But the difference now was that she'd learned how to turn those words into instruments of truth. She looked directly at the judge, her voice steady, low, deliberate. "Then let's talk about facts." A murmur rippled across the room. Jasmine didn't reach for her notes. She didn't need them. "Fact," she began. her tone measured. Our system loves order until order starts to protect inequality. Then it calls truth a disturbance. Someone in the back row gasped. The judge's eyes flickered. The faintest shift, but telling. Jasmine continued. Fact. We are told to speak calmly, as if calm has ever made the powerful listen faster. We're told to be respectful, but respect without honesty is just submission dressed up in manners. The words hit the chamber like a slow drum beat, each one echoing off the marble walls. She took a breath. And here's another fact, Your Honor. People like me aren't emotional because we're weak. We're emotional because we care. Because every time we see injustice dressed up as procedure, we're reminded of the generations who never got to sit in this room, whose stories were filed away as irrelevant. Judge Jones's fingers stilled on the gavel. For a moment, the judge wasn't in her chair. She was in her own past, standing in a classroom being told she was too assertive, sitting through meetings where men took credit for her work. The line between them blurred, just for an instant. Jasmine leaned forward, not to confront, but to connect. So when I speak with emotion, it's not anger, it's inheritance. It's history reminding this room that justice doesn't belong to those who whisper the quietest. It belongs to those who dare to speak when silence feels safer. The sound of her voice hung there, not sharp, not loud, but full, the kind of sound that lingers. Judge Jones's lips parted slightly, as if to respond, but nothing came out. The cameras caught the hesitation, the kind that says something real just happened here. Jasmine didn't gloat. She let the moment breathe. Then, softly, she delivered the line that would echo across the nation before the day was done. Respect isn't silence, she said. It's standing your ground when silence would be easier. For 3 full seconds, no one moved. The quote landed like thunder in slow motion. In the gallery, a young reporter felt her throat tighten. A staffer who had been typing notes paused mid-sentence. Even the court guards shifted uneasily, unsure whether they were witnessing defiance or something sacred. Then came the sound, faint at first, then unmistakable. Applause. Someone in the back, perhaps forgetting where they were, couldn't help but clap. It was quickly hushed, but the energy spread like a spark through dry air. Judge Jones didn't reprimand them. She just watched Jasmine, studying her, as if trying to decide whether she'd just been challenged or changed. Congresswoman Crockett, she said finally, her voice quieter now. You speak boldly. Jasmine smiled gently. Only because truth has been whispering for too long. A murmur of agreement swept through the seats. The judge adjusted her glasses, and though she didn't say it, everyone could see it, that subtle softening in her eyes. Not defeat, recognition. Outside, the first clips were already being uploaded. Journalists with sharp instincts had caught the shift, the way Jasmine's words seemed to cut through the static of the political noise. Within hours, those 10 seconds would be everywhere. But inside the chamber, the moment still lived in the air, untouched by the world's spin. Judge Jones straightened her papers, signaling an end. This hearing will recess for 15 minutes, she said. Her voice had changed. The authority remained, but something human had re-emerged beneath it. As the gavel struck, Jasmine gathered her notes, though she hadn't read a single one. The reporters lunged forward, whispering to each other, already crafting headlines. The judge watched her quietly as she stepped away. For the first time in years, Jones felt something like pride. She had challenged Jasmine Crockett, but Jasmine hadn't fought back. She had transformed the room. And the judge realized, perhaps too late, that what she'd witnessed wasn't defiance at all. It was integrity wrapped in grace. Outside, as Jasmine stepped into the blinding wash of cameras and flashbulbs, the questions came flying. Congresswoman, did you plan that? What message were you sending? Did you mean to call out the judge? She smiled, calm, composed, radiant. I didn't call anyone out. I called truth in. That clip would become the closing shot of countless reels. But for those who'd seen the full moment unfold, it wasn't about virality. It was about witnessing power, real power, shift hands without a single raised voice. And in living rooms across the country, people watched, replayed, and shared, not because it was dramatic, but because it was different. It was the kind of quiet strength they hadn't seen in years. By evening, millions had seen it. By morning, the quote was everywhere. And by the end of the week, something deeper had settled into the national conversation. Maybe courage didn't need shouting to be heard. Maybe dignity could be a revolution too. But for Jasmine Crockett, standing in the afterglow of that moment, heart steady and mind clear, she wasn't thinking about trends or headlines. She was thinking about her mother's voice, that quiet reminder from years ago. You don't stop because they expect you to. And she hadn't. Because in a world that confuses silence with respect, Jasmine Crockett had just reminded everyone, respect is what happens when truth finally refuses to bow. And outside those marble walls, the nation was just beginning to feel the tremor of what she'd set in motion. What came next would prove that this wasn't just a moment. It was a movement. By dawn, America had a new phrase echoing across its screens. Respect isn't silence. It was everywhere. On morning talk shows, on late-night monologues, stitched into TikToks, printed across protest posters, quoted under Instagram reels. The clip, 22 seconds long, showed Jasmine Crockett standing firm, her tone calm but unbreakable, her eyes steady on Judge Allison Jones. No shouting, no chaos, just truth, delivered with the quiet gravity of someone who knew what was at stake. And the internet couldn't get enough. Hashtags bloomed, hashtag Jasmine Crockett, hashtag respect isn't silence, hashtag modern courage. Within 12 hours, the video had 27 million views across platforms. Even the political cynics, the ones who normally shrugged off moments like this, were posting reactions. On Twitter, one journalist wrote, Jasmine Crockett didn't just win a hearing, she redefined composure. Another added, the look on Judge Jones's face says it all. Sometimes truth disarms faster than anger ever could. But it wasn't just the pundits. In a classroom in Detroit, a teacher paused her civics lesson to play the clip. Listen, she told her students. This is what courage sounds like. In a cafe in El Paso, an immigrant mother watched it 3 times on her phone before texting her daughter, This is why I raised you to never shrink. And somewhere in Seattle, a young law student, exhausted from another day of being talked over, replayed Jasmine's words and whispered to herself, maybe I can stay in this field after all. The ripple wasn't just digital, it was emotional, cultural. For Judge Allison Jones, the morning after was complicated. Her inbox overflowed, not with condemnation, but with unexpected praise. You held your ground with dignity, one message read. Another said, thank you for showing that power can evolve in real time. She watched the clip again, not as the judge, but as a woman who'd once believed that control was the same as respect. Now, she wasn't so sure. On a Sunday evening panel, when a host asked her about the moment, Judge Jones smiled faintly. It was clarifying, she said. Sometimes we need to be reminded that authority means listening too. The audience applauded. Not the kind of applause that celebrates drama, but the kind that acknowledges grace. Meanwhile, in the halls of Congress, the moment was already reshaping perception. Staffers whispered about the Crockett effect, the ability to command a room through restraint. Some dismissed it as viral luck. Others, especially younger lawmakers, saw something deeper, a template for power that didn't require rage to be righteous. And for Jasmine, the whirlwind was surreal. Her phone buzzed with messages from mentors, supporters, even rivals. But what she cherished most were the ones from strangers, ordinary people who saw themselves in her calm fire. One message stood out. It read, my daughter watched you today. She's 7. She said, she talks like she means it, and people listen. Thank you for showing her that's possible. That night, Jasmine sat alone in her office, scrolling through messages, the glow of the screen flickering against her face. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel it, the quiet fulfillment of knowing she'd done something that might outlast the headlines. But she also knew better than to think it would end here, because for every person who saw strength, there were others who saw a threat. Pundits on certain networks began spinning the moment as performance politics. They questioned her composure, her motive, even her femininity. Calculated, one commentator sneered. Another made-for-TV outburst from the progressive left. But the contrast was striking. While critics tried to shrink the moment, the people kept amplifying it. Clips of Jasmine's speech were now playing over slow-motion edits, underscored by cinematic music, her quotes captioned like movie lines. Respect isn't silence. We're emotional because we care. Truth doesn't bow. The movement wasn't being controlled by networks or parties. It was being shaped by the public, those who saw their own reflection in her restraint. And somewhere between all the noise, one truth emerged clearer than ever. When grace meets power, it rewrites the rules. In a viral tweet, a college activist wrote, "She didn't yell, she didn't fold. She stood, and the whole system had to pause." That's what leadership looks like. By the end of the week, polls showed a surprising spike, not just in Jasmine's favorability, but in something rarer: trust. People didn't just agree with her, they believed her. It wasn't about one hearing anymore. It was about something shifting, a new model of resistance that didn't depend on fury, but on moral steadiness. And as the nation buzzed, one headline captioned it perfectly: "She didn't shout, she stood, and America heard her." But beneath the praise and virality, a quiet question lingered, one that neither Jasmine nor the judge could escape. If words alone could shake the walls of power this much, what would happen when those same words turned into action? The answer was coming, and it would change everything. In the weeks that followed, the noise faded, as it always does. The hashtags slowed, the clips stopped trending, the pundits moved on to the next political storm. But what lingered wasn't noise, it was resonance. Everywhere Jasmine went, people didn't just recognize her, they remembered how she made them feel. A flight attendant in Atlanta stopped her mid-aisle. "You didn't just talk back, you talked through them." That's power. A pastor in Chicago quoted her line, "Respect isn't silence," during a Sunday sermon about courage. A group of teenage girls in Houston started a debate club named after her, where the rule was simple: no shouting, only truth. And deep down, Jasmine felt something shift, not in how she spoke, but in what her words carried. She'd spent years learning how to be heard in rooms that didn't want to listen. But now, she understood that being heard wasn't about the volume of your voice. It was about the weight of your purpose. One evening, she found herself watching the clip again. The moment Judge Jones had leaned back, the crowd holding its breath. For the first time, Jasmine noticed something she'd missed before: the faint smile at the edge of the judge's lips. Not defiance, not defeat. Understanding. Maybe that was the real victory, not silencing anyone, but awakening them. Later that week, Jasmine received a handwritten note in her office. The return address was simple: on Allison Jones. It read, "I have spent my life believing control was the measure of leadership. You reminded me that grace is the truer form of it. Thank you for the lesson." Jasmine smiled quietly. She placed the note in her drawer, not as a trophy, but as proof that even in the most rigid spaces, hearts could shift. In a televised interview soon after,
She was asked if she thought her words had changed anything. Jasmine paused before answering. "Change doesn't always start with laws," she said softly. "Sometimes it starts with how we treat each other when the world is watching. Sometimes it's not about being right. It's about being real enough to make someone listen." The host nodded, visibly moved. Viewers at home felt it too, that rare sincerity that can't be staged. And as the camera slowly zoomed in, Jasmine added one last thought. Dignity isn't quiet. It's patient. It waits until the noise dies down, and then it tells the truth anyway. That line, understated, almost whispered, became the quiet heartbeat of a growing movement. Months later, when young candidates quoted her in campaign speeches, when social media pages carried her words as captions, when protesters wrote her phrases on cardboard signs, Jasmine's legacy wasn't defiance. It was composure turned into courage. And somewhere, in the calm after the storm, Judge Allison Jones stood in her own courtroom, staring at the seal above her bench. She thought of Jasmine Crockett and smiled. Maybe justice wasn't about who spoke louder. Maybe it was about who refused to surrender their humanity while speaking at all. Because in the end, that's what Jasmine had taught the country. That strength isn't found in the fight itself, but in the way you carry your truth through it. And that's why long after the cameras stopped rolling and the headlines moved on, people kept returning to that one moment, that one sentence that cut through the noise and rewrote what leadership looked like. Respect isn't silence. It was no longer just a quote. It was a reminder that grace, when grounded in conviction, can still shake the walls of power. And somewhere in the echo of those words, America heard itself becoming a little braver. The hearing had ended weeks ago, but the echo of Jasmine Crockett's words still lingered, in headlines, in classrooms, in everyday conversations about who we are and what we stand for. Respect isn't silence. It wasn't just a statement anymore. It was a standard. Because in an age of shouting matches and viral takedowns, Jasmine had done something revolutionary. She had made decency feel powerful again. Her moment with Judge Allison Jones became more than a political clip. It became a cultural mirror. It reminded America that integrity doesn't need volume to be heard, and that real courage often walks hand in hand with restraint. And maybe that's why millions couldn't stop replaying that 20-second exchange. They weren't just watching a politician, they were watching a lesson about voice, patience, and the kind of respect that doesn't surrender truth. As the screen fades to black, Jasmine's quote returns, glowing against a backdrop of her calm face before the gavel. Respect isn't silence. It's standing your ground when silence would be easier. The music swells, soft, proud, cinematic. Then the narrator's voice cuts through with one final call. If her words moved you, share them. Because somewhere, someone's being told to quiet down when they should be speaking up. Let them see this. Let them know their calm has power too. Pause. Subscribe to the movement. Share the truth. Because moments like this remind us, when one woman stands her ground with grace, the whole world listens. The screen fades out on her name, Jasmine Crockett, and underneath, one line glows like a promise. Dignity, courage, America at its best.